Welcome y bienvenidos to episode 96 of Love Learning You. I am your hostess, Justine Gonzalez. Let's get into it here with this reflective edge reset. Now, you might be noticing this name, and I will link in the show notes for you access to my monthly newsletter, which is called The Reflective Edge. I wanted to add a companion piece. Number one, you all know I tell on myself here on the podcast. I needed more accountability for my consistency with the podcast. So please expect that around one time per week, every week, I will release one shorter episode, which is about anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes long, a workshop style that is called a reflective edge reset. And the reason why I want to give this structure is not only that it complements my workflows, but most of all, it is a shorter form and responsive to feedback. We are now streaming to listeners in nearly 50 countries, and I can't thank you all enough for giving me the opportunity to just share some of my own learning journey here. So if you're loving it, make sure that you always share where you find value. Make sure that you give us a great review and always hit subscribe on your preferred platform, especially if you're listening right now on Spotify. Shout out to Spotify for walking alongside me in podcasting for so many years as we are all growing and shifting in the digital age. So let's get into it. This workshop is all about how identity is shaped by our patterns of life. And identity, you may have heard me in episode 95, the episode on psycho-cybernetics and how to really activate our creative energy, especially if you've been feeling a little bit as I like to call it, creatively constipated. But today, one of the things I spoke about in episode 95 was identity. And I broke down that etymologically, the word is broken into id and entity from the original root words. And id is essentially ego, okay? The ego. And ego serves many roles in our lives from a neurological standpoint, from a sociological standpoint, psychological standpoint, etc. However, one of the things we have to remember that in this particular form of the word, entity, when we really look at the literal meaning of the word identity or identities, they are entities run by ego or dominated by ego. Now, what does this mean? Ego wants us to be safe. So it gives us some form of meaning or labeling or categorization of ourselves. That is why so many of us, myself included, throughout our lives, we latch on to perhaps the labels of organized religions, the labels of organized sororities and fraternities, the labels of clubs and associations, even titles, licensures, credentials. I'm actually part of a unique international community. We are certified trainers, and they were actually calling their biannual international convening a congress, which is very interesting. But I'm looking at all of these things throughout our lives, and we have so many ways that we choose to identify in all of the different realms we show up in life. And there's two researchers I want to highlight today. And you all know in these reflective edge resets, I want to give you some research as well as a strategy. And I want this to be applicable in your life where I have been doing decades of research around these matters, as well as my own lived experiences when it comes to cultural psychology matters and also matters of the heart. And the two different researchers I want to feature today are the work of Ruth Benedict from the 1930s specifically, so nearly 100 years ago, still seeing a lot of the same things she researched today, followed by Shinobu Kitayama, who is a Japanese social psychologist serving currently at the University of Michigan in the United States. Now, when I found both of their work years ago, I was floored because it just spoke to me in so many ways on so many levels. And one thing I want to name and point out it was very glaring because this is a newer field in psychology, cultural psychology, as well as cultural neuroscience. These are newer fields in the past few decades, couple of decades, probably about early 90s, okay? If we're looking at timeline wise and the litany of research that exists. So one of the trends though that you find is often those countries that are not Western or Eastern exclusively, they are not included. So if we want to look specifically at Caribbean, African, Indian, different areas of the world. So India, all of the different countries, languages, cultures represented all across the massive continent of Africa. When it boils down to it, plain and simple, Westernized psychology as well as European psychologists have often been the priority, lending themselves to controlling the narrative. And one of the pieces I want to give you specifically about Kitayama's research and where he's passionate about, you can find this at part of the University of Michigan website, the Culture and Cognition Lab. And in his most recent article, it literally is titled, Shinobu Kitayama Wants Psychology to Represent People in Non-Western Societies Too. I love how he is leading the way in so much of the work across North America, in particular the United States, and a lot of the research themes that you'll find as part of the Culture and Cognition Lab are cultural neuroscience, culture and health, and then also globalizing cultural psychology. You also see some papers that are in preprint and PDFs that you can download. One of the first ones featured, I love it. It is from Osei Tutu, and it is Revealing Self-Promotive Interdependence Through Emotion, a cultural logic from sub-Saharan Africa. I love it. So I'm just pointing this out so you all have context of who are the researchers featured today and the bodies of research. Let's hop into our 3 points about how our identity is really shaped by the patterns of our lives and why a reflective reset, such as this every week, is really, really beneficial to incorporate into our practices. So let's first start with point number 1. Identity is shaped by the culture of the existing time, so the patterns of life. And so Ruth Benedict, in her text, Patterns of Culture, her body of research, a lot of it is featured in Patterns of Culture from 1934. And in this text, she emphasized that every culture selects certain values and ways of being that they cultivate as normal or quote unquote desirable. So both of those words, I'm using air quotes, normal or desirable. And that means simply that our sense of identity is not simply individual to us. It's actually deeply patterned by the cultural context that we grow up in. Discovering who we are often requires reflecting on which cultural patterns that we have inherited and whether they align with our authentic selves. And I know a lot of Kitayama's work also touches on epigenetics. I have quite a few on the Love Learning You YouTube channel. There are quite a few different standalone workshops on your cultural origin story and diving more into defining culture. So if you're a little lost on anything in this episode, be sure that you click the link to go check out the workshops on the Love Learning You YouTube channel. Back to here. We have plenty of resources for you all. So we want to move on to the next point. But the first one is, again, remember that culture and the patterns of our lives are really what shape our identities. Okay. And then obviously part of that culture is sprinkling in understanding where our norms, beliefs, and values, those 3 tenets of culture, where they derive from, and is some of that also dependent on how gene expression is, right? Our DNA, how our physical bodies happen to come into this world and how we're perceived by other humans. So many different directions, but plain and simple, point number 1, remember that identity is shaped by the patterns of your life and the culture that you're living in, the cultural context that you're living in. The second point I want to share with you all is this idea of independence versus interdependence. And this, in all the way back in 1991, some of Kitayama's earlier work with Hazel Marcus, a lot of the work of independence versus interdependence is highlighted by how our different cultures around the world foster models of selfhood. Okay. So, for example, Western cultures often emphasize independent self. So, autonomy, uniqueness, individuality, what makes you stand out. And this particular body of work, we also examined East Asian and collectivist cultures that nurture more of an interdependent self, which means we are fixated more on connectedness with each other, harmony, living with one another, and supporting one another's soul journeys in life. So, exploring identity involves also recognizing where we fall on this spectrum and how our cultural backgrounds have shaped our default mode, so to speak, our default way of thinking about me versus we, and how those two fit together. So the second thing to consider in your reflection this week is, how do I operate most? Am I more of an independence or interdependence leaning person? And don't sit in judgment of it. This is simply to evaluate, when it comes to my own identity and how it's shaped, how do I usually operate, how I show up? Is it driven by independence or interdependence? And finally, the third point I want to give you all from this vast body of research, just a few key points to digest super quick, but then ponder over the next week until we meet again. The third is understanding your own self-discovery journey, and then look at it as cultural navigation. And I often think my brain is often visualizing in roadmaps, which is why I'm great with strategic planning with the organizations I consult with. And all of that is identifying the patterns that exist and understanding how to navigate them. And navigation has so many different layers to it, because when we really think about a ship setting sail, for example, if I think of a navigation system for being on the water, there are so many pieces that go into that, and making sure that that navigation actually guides us where we want to go. So when we haven't deeply examined ourselves in discovery mode, not default mode, discovery mode, which is really igniting our new neural pathways, it's creating new meaning for us in our brains, and it's getting us out of our comfort zone to create more plasticity. I can't say that word right. It's okay to laugh at me. I'm laughing at myself. But you know what I mean? The stickiness of those neural pathways, plasticity. I think that's how you say it. So cultural psychology itself, it actually reminds us that our identities are not fixed. They are actually negotiated across contexts. And Ruth Benedict's works showed how cultural relativism prevents us from judging one culture's way as quote unquote better. And then further advancements, we look, 70, 80 years down the road from Ruth Benedict's work, Kitayama demonstrated and continues to show that our self-concepts, they flex depending on the social settings that we are in. And this gives us permission as humans to view our identities as an evolving process, a journey that does require navigation, navigating multiple cultural influences, questioning our inherited norms, and making conscious choices about who we want to become each and every day. All right, so I'm going to include a link to a free download of these points with some questions for your pondering. I will also be sharing this across social media channels, so you might be able to grab it there too. Make sure you're following me at those channels that I've linked for you in the show notes. And again, if you're finding value, be sure to hit subscribe real quick. It does help us out over here to keep doing this. Helps me out. Let me be clear. I love the creative process and contributing and showing up with my gifts and talents in the unique ways that I've experienced the world. So to recap what we've looked at today, with really understanding how cultural patterns influence, or the patterns of life rather, influence our identities and how we show up, is this. Identity is shaped by our cultural patterns. That's number one. And as Ruth Benedict showed us in Patterns of Culture, her collection of a lot of her research essays and body of research, Each society elevates certain values as quote unquote normal. So part of discovering who we are is asking which of these cultural patterns truly reflect me and which do I want to rewrite. So if you haven't and you wanted to take notes or you want to pause it or bookmark, now would be the time to do that, because here's where I'm giving you the application questions. Our reflective edge resets, remember, they are once a week, these style of episodes on the Love Learning You podcast. And I will always highlight a featured researcher or two or a body of research we're focused on, followed by some real strategy for how to reflect on it with some core questions I've developed for you. So, number one, identity shaped by cultural patterns. And the question to ask ourselves for deeper reflection: which of these cultural patterns truly reflect me and which do I want to rewrite? And this also ties a lot into nationalism and asking yourself, who do you pledge allegiance to and why? Just wanted to insert that really quick for such a time as this. Okay, number two, the reviewing point, and then I am also going to give us a question to go a little deeper. And that is a reminder of Shinobu Kitayama's work and how he reminds us that some cultures nurture independence, being unique and autonomous, while other cultures emphasize interdependence, being connected and harmonious. And exploring our identity means noticing where we've been shaped on this spectrum and how that shows up in our daily behaviors and choices. So the question to go deeper with this particular point is asking yourself, am I more independent or interdependent? And it might look different in your different roles, right? It might look different in your home life versus professional life and how you feel you have to show up in those roles. Finally, the third point was all about using our identity and its evolutionary process as the navigation tool in our life, as a way to guide us. So when we examine both Benedict's and Kitayama's work, it reminds us that identity is not fixed at all. It shifts as we move across contexts. It shifts as we learn and grow in our lives. That means that self-discovery is less about finding some set answer or saying, yes, I've finally reached this point. Okay, and then what? And then what? you know, and more about learning to navigate, adapt, be in acceptance of ourselves, of others, and be okay with it, and also to choose our own destiny and who we are becoming. And yes, we should be designing our own destinies. I believe walking hand in hand with the Creator. And I just want to put that out there and leave you with those 3 points. So when you consider this week, as you go throughout your week and asking yourself these questions, just start to notice. Why am I responding this way? And I see this person responding this way. Interesting. I wonder what all their background has been in life. I wonder what all of their experiences have been like. Start to get curious. And if you find yourself in a space of reaction to what somebody has done or said, then we have to ask ourselves, why am I reacting in this way? So there are behaviors that they're showing me. What are these signals telling me right now? Once again, make sure you check out all the resources in the show notes. I have just not only the download from this, but any other opportunities or ways to connect will always be in the show notes. I appreciate you all being on the journey of my life, right? This is my space to also be transparent with you all. So thank you for the ongoing accountability. Check out this month's newsletter. There's a new article dropping. Those usually take about 10 minutes or so to dig into, and they're very research heavy. But then there's typically always this podcast element to accompany the newsletter. So you're going to see me kind of blending some of these identities, so to speak, that have to do with Love Learning You together, and all the work I am so passionate about, whether it is cultural or emotional intelligence, cultural psychology, the work of neuroscience, etc., but all of the ways that we can tap into to really love learning more about ourselves and our lived experiences. Because when we do that, we can be more present and accepting and loving of who we are each and every day, which allows us to share more love and more openness with others that we encounter. Okay, Thank you for tuning into this episode of Love Learning You. I'm Justine Gonzalez, and I can't wait until we get together next time. Talk soon, and let's continue to get compassionately curious together. Take care.